Well, good evening, Crossroads. How are we doing tonight? You're distracted because your mouth is watering, isn't it? Like you've been thinking and talking about the one thing. See, I'm gonna take what Noah and Talia both said and I'm gonna put it together and I'm gonna say a number one from In-N-Out. That's what I'm gonna say, because then I get the double-double and I get the fry. It sounds like many of you would say the same thing. Although there's one other thing that I might do. My fear, though, is I'm too self-conscious enough to maybe go with this one because I'm afraid I would start to smell like it. I could probably eat shrimp every day for the rest of my. I love shrimp. It is amazing. But anyways, that's mine. So now that we're all hungry, let's do this in about 5 minutes, shall we? Is that good? And we'll go to dinner. Hey, welcome. We are in a series going through the book of James. And this story that I'm going to tell you, I have permission to share it. And by permission, I mean I went up to Tim Roberts and I said, hey, I'm going to tell him the racketball story. And so let me tell you about what happened when I first got hired at Crossroads in 2015. I was excited and I wanted to meet, obviously, a lot of people on staff, and I wanted to build relationships, and I felt like, man, this is going to be a great place for us to put down roots. And one time we were in a meeting and I heard somebody say that Tim Roberts, our worship pastor, he plays pickleball now. He played racquetball. And I was like, oh my gosh, I play racquetball too. Like when I was in college, me and my buddies, we'd go to the racquetball court and we would just like see if we could hit a racquetball so hard that it would explode. Like that's playing racquetball, right? Like that's what you do. And so I went up to Tim one day and I said, hey, I hear you play racquetball. And he goes, yeah, I play. I was like, oh, that's cool. We should go play sometime. And he goes, okay. And I was like, cool. And so many months went by and we never played racquetball. And I didn't really understand why. Until one day I was at my house and it's like 4 o'clock. I just got home. And he's like, hey, you want to come play racquetball? I was like, yes. Oh my gosh, of course. I've been waiting for this. So I was like, but I don't have a racquetball like racket. Like he's, oh, don't worry, I got extras. You're good. Just come to LA Fitness and we'll play racquetball. I'm like, okay, great. So I show up and you walk in, I'm walking in and I was like, oh man, this is a big moment here. Like this is me like trying to prove my athletic prowess here at Crossroads. And I'm about to go into this racquetball court with Tim Roberts. And I walk in and Tim will tell you that what I'm about to say is not true. As God is my witness, it is 100% true. It is 100% true. I will also add the caveat that Tim was phenomenally humble about this whole experience. But what I did tell Tim is every time that you get used as a sermon illustration, the way that the pastor or communicator presents a story is there is so much embellishment into the story that it either makes you look way worse than you are or it makes you look way better than you are. And there's no middle ground. So if you ever get used in a sermon illustration, hope that you're on like way better than you are kind of story. I've got too many stories of being on this side of it. So I walk in and I grab a racket and he's in there, and I'm not kidding you. He's in there, he's got his shorts on, he's got his racquetball shoes on, and he has a zip hoodie. I remember this like it was yesterday because it impacted me. And he's got a zip hoodie and he's got a backwards hat on. I mean, Tim's wardrobe has not changed in the time that he's been. So I go in and I've got like athletic shirt, athletic shorts, like the fastest shoes I could find, and this racket that I just grabbed out of his racquetball bag, which by the way, I think there's like 30 rackets in there. And so I walk in there, he's right-handed, his left hand is in his pocket. And so we start playing, and as God is my witness, his hand never came out of his jacket pocket the entire time when he played me, which means his jacket also never came off, and his hat stayed on the entire time. We played 3 games. You play racquetball to 15. He beat me a combined score of 45-4. It felt like we played for 2 hours. It was probably 8 minutes. And you guys, I'm not kidding you, I was drenched in sweat. Like I was gassed. And Tim, the whole time, hand in pocket, point. We finish this 3rd game, and he looks at me and he goes, thanks for coming. Thanks, I'm not kidding you. Thanks for warming me up. The opponent that I'm going to play is here now. And when he tells me this, I think I was like this. Did you say warm up? So I look back at this opponent. I'm in my early-ish 30s at this time. And I look back, and there's a guy who I swear was in his late 50s, ready to take him on. And I thought, ouch. No offense if you're in your late 50s, by the way. Ouch. So I'm like, no problem. So I go and I put the racket into his bag and I walk into the restroom, and I have all these emotions flowing through me at this time. And one of them is I need to towel off because I need to make it not look like I sweated as much as I did. So I'm grabbing paper towels out of the LA Fitness bathroom, and I'm I'm just scrubbing myself down because I'm embarrassed. And I thought that was the end of the embarrassment, because when I walk back out and I walk by the racquetball court, Tim has since taken his hat off and unzipped his jacket, taken it off, and now he is sweating against this 50-year-old guy that's working him in racquetball. I was so embarrassed. Can I say this? I have never played racquetball with Tim Roberts ever again. And that's not by my choice. I guarantee you, that was by his choice. Why? Because when I walked into racquetball that day, I probably looked like I had never played serious racquetball before. What are some of the clues? Well, for starters, I didn't have my own racket. So that's probably a dead giveaway. I didn't have racquetball shoes on. And unfortunately for me, Tim never took his hat off and never took his sweatshirt off against me, and his hand never left his pocket. As God is my witness, that is a true story. See, there's something about when somebody walks into an environment, when you begin to assign value of what kind of person is walking into your presence. When I walked into LA Fitness that day, Tim thought, this is going to be a warm-up of some kind, and I don't think I really warmed him up that much that day. But he knew just by looking at me that I was, not a racquetball player. But the guy behind me was. Why? He had a racquetball bag. He had multiple rackets. He had racquetball shoes on. He probably had a racquetball shirt. They probably all did. And I probably showed up in some Nike shirt. I don't know. And so you walk in, and all of a sudden you begin to tell all of the signs about the kind of person that you are. Now, again, Tim was incredibly humble about this. He refutes the story. This profoundly impacted me deeply, because I was phenomenally embarrassed that day. So I remember it like it was yesterday. But there's something about ourselves when we see other people walk into our environment where we begin to size people up. That might be in your workplace. That might be in a public place. That might be in your own family when you have family gatherings and Uncle so-and-so walks through the door and you're like, here we go. We've all got those kinds of scenarios. In James chapter 2, James takes this letter and he begins to address this particular issue, because what's happening that James is very concerned about is that there is a sin of favoritism happening. There is a sin of partiality happening, because he's very concerned about the well-to-do Jewish audience that he is writing to, that do believe that Jesus Christ is who he said he was. And what's happening is people are walking into their church, and people are taking one look at the people walking in, and they're assigning a value to them. And they're looking, and James has some very important words for them to share. And this is why this is so important, because in James chapter 1, where Pastor Chuck was at last week, Pastor Chuck talked all about how it's not just talking a talk, it's walking a walk. It's being able to live out not just the things that it's not just saying things that you say, but it's living out the things that you say. In other words, it's like, it's time to put your money where your mouth is. Are you going to do the things that you are learning about? Are you going to do the things that I have shared with you about? And I think it's really telling that this is the first thing that James talks about after he says, hey, make sure your actions match your words. And I think this is pretty personal for James, because what James presents here is not a very obvious sin, right? Some of the sins are obvious, right? Like the sin of murder, that's pretty obvious. Stealing. Sometimes, most of the time, that comes to light. That's pretty obvious. There's certain things that happen. that come to mind that we think, well, it's easy to avoid those. But this particular issue, I love that James goes here because he recognizes that there's something that they need to hear from him. There's something that they need to learn from him. And he presents this sin that is not very obvious. And maybe for you and I, it's a sin that we commit that isn't readily obvious or isn't. Maybe we don't even know that we are committing the sin of partiality or we are committing the sin of favoritism. I think James is presenting something here. I love reading everything that James writes because you can feel such a personal tie to what he's writing. You see, I don't think James would identify himself as a murderer or a thief. In fact, the subtlety of his personal sin was what you and I would probably say is, well, that's not really an egregious moral sin. We would say that the sin of treating somebody with favoritism, treating somebody different, I think every single person in here, if we truly sat down and we were honest with ourselves, we would say, I mean, maybe showing favor to somebody else isn't that egregious of a like a moral lapse. Like that's not that big of a deal, right? I mean, look, come on, murder's way worse. Stealing's way worse. Your anger on the 91 freeway is way worse. Like there's all kinds of things that we think about. What's incredible though, is I feel like what James presents here, he talks about a sin that they're struggling with. And you know what? I believe James actually struggled with a sin early on that maybe wasn't as noticeable. And it was this. James's sin early on was that he didn't see his half-brother, Jesus, as the Messiah. And maybe you're sitting there thinking, well, did you just say not recognizing Jesus as the Messiah is a sin? But, I mean, I'm kind of a good person. I do nice things. But yet in John chapter 16, verse 9, here's what John records Jesus saying. You ready for this? The world's sin is that it refuses to believe in me. This is what James was guilty of. He didn't believe his half-brother. We've talked about this in this series already. Can you imagine what it would be like to grow up with Jesus as your brother? The amount of times that you would experience your parents, who, by the way, were not perfect, Mary and Joseph were not perfect. They would say, I have to believe because I'm a sinful parent myself. I might utter the words, can you be a little bit more like your brother next time, please? And so you can understand the frustration and the resentment and the bitterness that James is experiencing, and yet John records Jesus saying, the world's sin is that it refuses to believe in me. John 7:5 says that for even Jesus' brothers didn't even believe him. So here's James writing from a place of complete conviction, essentially saying this. Look, there's some obvious sins in the world today. There's some obvious sins that are happening within the community of believers that you guys are experiencing together. But there's also some subtle sins that can go unnoticed and therefore unchecked, which leads us into exactly what he writes about in James chapter 2. We're going to start off in verses 1 through 4. If you want to follow along, you can jump into the app. And if you want to open your Bible, you can do that. You open your Bible app, you could do that as well. James chapter 2, verses 1 through 4 says this, my dear brothers and sisters, how can you claim to have faith in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ if you favor some people over others? Don't you feel like it'd be more appropriate if it was like, hey, my dear brothers and sisters, how can you claim to have faith in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ if you keep murdering people? If you keep stealing from people? If you keep deceiving people? But he says, if you favor some people over others? Verse 2, for example, let me give you an example. We all love an example. For example, suppose someone comes into your meeting. By the way, this Greek word for meeting actually means church gathering. Your church, your community of believers. That's what that word here means in the Greek. For example, suppose someone comes into your meeting dressed in fancy clothes and expensive jewelry, and another comes in who is poor and dressed in dirty clothes. If you give special attention and a good seat to the rich person, but you say to the poor one, you just stand over there or go sit on the floor. Well, doesn't this show discrimination? Doesn't this discrimination show that your judgments are guided by evil motives? So he presents this particular example. There's 3 failures that we experience when it comes to favoritism. 3 things that happen. And I'm going to be honest with you. as I studied for this particular section of Scripture, and as I prepared for this message, I was phenomenally convicted. And I think I was convicted in ways that I wasn't expecting to be convicted. Because oftentimes we take this particular example that James leads with, and most of the time and when I first read it, I always read the passage, I'll pray over it, and then I'll start to study. I'll read it again, I'll study more, I'll do all of that. And of course, when I read this, it was like, rich people, poor people. I'm going to be nicer to people that have money, and I'm not going to be as nice to people that have that are poor, because in my flesh, I recognize that poor people can't do as much for me as rich people could. I bet in me revealing my inner thoughts, I bet some of your inner thoughts are probably some of the same. There's 3 failures of favoritism. The first one is this. Number 1, favoritism contradicts an authentic faith. Like, whoa. It's just favoritism. Favoritism contradicts an authentic faith. Now, one of the things we have to understand about the context of why James is writing this is we have to go back and we have to understand how church gatherings, how church meetings would happen back in the day. And already, based on what happened back then, we're already doing it vastly different today than they did back then. For starters, here's how this would usually go. The person who was going to come out and read the scroll, the person who was going to come out and read the Old Testament scriptures, when we read in the New Testament, the scriptures that they had were the Old Testament scriptures. That's why there's so many prophecies that point to Jesus in the New Testament, and it's pointing to Jesus. And so what would happen is they would come out, and in Luke chapter 4, we actually see Jesus go into the synagogue and into the temple, and he's handed the scroll and the prophecy of Isaiah chapter 61, and it says this, you ready? It says that Jesus unravels the scroll, he reads it, and then he does something. And it's not super profound, but it helps us understand why James is using this particular scenario. You ready for it? It says Jesus sits down. And you know what everybody else would have done? They would have stood up. So tonight, I'm going to sit, and you guys are going to stand. I'm just kidding. If you know me, I cannot sit still. So I would be out of that chair in a second. But already it looks different. Now, in these cases, what would happen is somebody would walk out, they would stand. It was very much an honor culture, right? Please hear me. I'm not saying you're not honoring me by not standing right now. That's not what I'm saying. All right. But it was an honor culture, so people would stand when they would read, and then they would teach, and the teacher would sit, and everybody else who was listening would stand. Now, there were some people that couldn't stand for very long. The elderly, they couldn't stand very long. People that might have been dealing with an ailment of some kind couldn't stand very long. And so what would happen is they would have special seats available for people that would be closer towards where the teacher would teach. And so what would happen is they would take those that needed the chair most, and they would usher them in, and they would say, please sit here, we know you can't stand very long. So when James writes and says, hey, let me give you an example. And by the way, I love these examples because chances are the example was actually a real life scenario, right? All the training videos that you do for like HR, all the training things. Some of our staff got to do a 2-day training on Monday and Tuesday this week, and we got to see a lot of fictitious scenarios that were dramatized. But the person who did the training for us told us they all came from true events or they were inspired by true events. So here's James taking this example, and he says, let me give you an example. And I already know he's thinking, I can't wait to share this one because it's going to be profound. So what would happen is he's describing this particular scenario where somebody would walk in, and boy, did they look well-to-do. Boy, did they look wealthy. Boy, did they look like things were going well in their lives. And what James is addressing here is what's happening is they're going over to the people that are sitting in these chairs, and they're like, hey, get out of here. Hey, there's somebody that's more important than you that needs to sit in this seat over here, because chances are they're going to be able to do more for us and our community than you could ever do. You imagine? You imagine? Some of you sitting in front right now, right? Can you imagine Lorraine, somebody comes up to you and says, hey, look, Lorraine, I know you've been here for a long time. And I know that this is your seed every single week, but there's somebody that could do way more for our church than you could ever do. Could you imagine? You know how many of you would get up and leave? And deservedly so, right? Lorraine would get up and leave herself too. She's like, I'm out of here too. You can have the seat. You can have all the seats in here. But yet this is what was happening. Now, understanding that particular context of this story leads us into the next. You see, it's easy for us to imagine like, well, nowadays, here in our Western world, it's really dangerous, by the way, when we see Scripture through a Western lens, because the Western world didn't even exist at this time. Because for you and I, there's all kinds of different socioeconomic classes that exist among us, right? I bet if I told every single one of you to go home right now, don't do it, but you'd go home and I tell you, come back in your best dressed attire, I feel like all of us, it'd be so subjective and we'd be like, man, I can't tell who's rich and who's not. I can't tell when people are walking in here, but it would have been way different back then. 8% of the population in that time, scholars roughly estimate, people were wealthy. 8%. There was no such thing as a middle class. I'm going to make an assumption right now. I'm going to say that most of us, somewhere we float back and forth, somewhere in the middle class. Most of us probably do. We might be like lower middle class, we might be middle class, we might be upper middle class, but predominantly most of us, we're probably like somewhere in there. Some of us might be a little bit further down the scale in maybe not quite middle class, but maybe like lower to middle class, right? Some of us might be on the other side and we'd be like, well, I'm more on like the upper class. There was no such thing as this. It was this spectrum or this spectrum. 8% of the world, about that much, were wealthy. 90% of the people are considered what you and I would imagine today as poor. Probably living beyond their means, probably needing help and handouts as often as they could get them. And about 2% were people that were gaining wealth. Now what's funny is the 2% that were gaining wealth, it was probably ill-gotten gain. It's probably what it was. People that were deceptive, people that were deceiving. But this is what we're talking about. So it would have been blatantly obvious. And it's not necessarily the kind of culture that we understand today. In fact, in Deuteronomy chapter 11 and 12, it talks about this. And it acknowledges the kind of culture that existed, that there was no such thing as middle class. It was you either had money or you didn't. You either had, you were able to live well or you were able to live and you needed a lot of help from a lot of people. In Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 11 and 12, there's this command, and it says this: you must wait outside while he goes in and brings out a coat to you. If your neighbor is poor, give his cloak to you as a security loan, and do not keep the cloak overnight. That's how poor people were. They were using cloaks as collateral damage in these. Like, how are you going to secure this thing? You better bring that coat back tomorrow. That's all that I had. It was a borrowed coat that somebody would need to be able to bring back. And this is phenomenally different the way that we would read this passage then and understand what's happening, and for us to be able to read this today. This context actually helps us understand that James' invitation, by addressing his brothers and sisters, puts him and everyone else on the same playing field, regardless of socioeconomic standing. And the most prominent way that people favored others then was simply, because it was so obvious, the way that somebody looked, the way that somebody dressed. There was no hiding how poor you were back then. There was no hiding it. And because it was such a curse in that society, you would never try to present yourself as poor. You would always dress yourself up. So anybody that would walk through that door, if this was 2,000 years ago, it would be immediately obvious that you're either poor, you're in the 90%, or you're in the 8%. That's where this goes. There was a recent article that came out in the Journal of Business Ethics, and it's written by a guy by the name of Bjorn Hoffman, and he coins this term, aesthetic injustice. Think about that, aesthetic injustice. My daughter just turned 12 a week ago today, and she is all about how the aesthetics are. I'm going to pay her $1 for telling this story. It's not even in my notes. But I have to pay her $1. Every time I talk about one of my kids, I got to pay him $1. And so anyways, she's all about the aesthetics. How does something look? And I would expect nothing different than a 12-year-old girl. How does something look? How does something look? She judges my outfits. She judges my wife's outfits. She judges her brother's outfits, maybe a little bit more harsh. The problem with her brother's outfits, they're always like so good. He's just got a knack. Anyways, she has this aesthetic bent towards things. And this author who writes this article makes this claim, and he defines aesthetic injustice as this: unfair treatment of persons due to their appearance as perceived or assessed by others. Think about that. Injustice is a word that's been thrown around a lot in our country the last few years. You put aesthetic right in front of that, aesthetic injustice. Now we're talking about really just judging somebody based on how they look, what they wear. Do they look rich? Do they look poor? And it's one of those two things. And since humanity started with Adam and Eve, prejudice has filled the hearts of men, judging people based on their appearance and therefore showing preferential treatment and then eventual detrimental treatment because of someone's appearance has long been a struggle. This isn't new. This isn't something that this church would have heard and been like, oh, we didn't realize we were doing it. It would have been blatantly obvious. But for you and I today, this is something that can creep up on us. There's some things that happen that we do that maybe we don't necessarily intend to do. The word that James uses for favor or favoritism is the Greek word prosopolempsia. Prosopolempsia, and it means this, partiality, and it comes from this Greek word which means acceptor of a face, which purely means that when James is writing this, he is talking directly to judging somebody based on their appearance. Based on their appearance. When James writes this to those that are in the first century who are Jewish, who, by the way, was his audience, he's writing this to Jews while under Roman law. He's not saying something that's new to them. They would have understood this. They would have known. And in the Old Testament, in Israel's rich history, they would have understood that humanity, that one man and the next man and the next person and the next person and the next person all would have been predisposed to looking at somebody and assigning a value to them. There's an incredible story in 1 Samuel chapters 15 and 16 where God rejects King Saul as king over Israel. You see, Israel looked at themselves and they looked at other countries and they said, we want to be like other countries, therefore we want a king. And the Lord handed them over to their desire. I think God oftentimes hands us over to our desires as well. And he gave them exactly what they wanted. They wanted a king. And they picked a terrible one. You know why? Because they looked around at other countries and they said, boy, all the kings of all the neighboring countries, they're tall, they're strong, they're mighty warriors. Let's pick our tallest, strongest, most handsome, mighty warrior of all time. And they pick a guy named Saul. And Saul goes back and forth and he has a rough time at being king. And eventually God rejects Saul as king. And he sends a man named Samuel to go and deliver this news to Saul. God also tells him, you need to go to the house of Jesse because one of his sons is going to become king. So Samuel goes to the house of Jesse, gets there, knocks on the door, and he says, hey, I was here sent by God, and one of your sons is going to be king. Guess what Samuel thought? Or guess what Jesse thought? It's got to be the oldest. It's always the oldest, right? It's always the oldest child that gets all the... So he brings out his oldest child and he goes, here he is. And the Lord tells Samuel, whoa. That's not him. Samuel looks at him and he's like, well, he's kind of tall and he looks like a mighty warrior. And are you sure, God? Yep. So he looks at Jesse and says, it's not him. Really? Not my tall, firstborn? Like the son of my right hand? This is my... No, it's not him. All right, well, bring the second one. Bring the second, the third, the fourth, bring them all forward. It's none of them. And Samuel goes, I think I'm in the right house. Jesse, you got any more kids? And Jesse goes, almost forgot. There's another one. He's out watching the sheep. You sure you want him? It's kind of a hassle to like call for him, but if you're sure, okay, bring him in. David walks in. Lord says, that's the guy. That's the guy. And in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 7, it says this, the Lord said to Samuel, don't judge by his height or appearance, for I have rejected him, talking about his first son. The Lord doesn't see things the way that you see them. You ready for it? People judge by outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. This is our detail. This is our learning objective right here, that we must judge people by their heart, which, by the way, you know what this means? We have to get to know people, which, by the way, is one of the ways that we show favoritism. One of the things that I love about Wednesday nights, we've gotten really good at it. I remember coming out the first couple of times that we decided that we wanted Wednesday nights to be a little bit different than the way that we experienced the weekend. If you're here on the weekend, there's a noticeable absence of something that we do on Wednesday nights. We don't do greeting time on Sunday. Maybe that's why we have so many more people on Sunday. I'm just kidding. But we don't do greeting on Sunday. So we want to create more of a familial experience here. And I remember the first couple times I'd walk out, and we'd say we'd give you 2 minutes, and I would walk out, and this is what you guys would look like the first couple times that we did it when the timer's hitting 0. Some of you guys were even like kind of doing that. You're looking back and like, just hit 0. Geez, we got to start this thing. This is awkward. This is what happens, right? But yet, every time I've come out here for at least the past, 9 months, I can't get you guys to shut up, which is great. But you know what sometimes happens in the middle of this? That's why one of the things that we're very intentional about in saying is, go find somebody that you haven't met. This is a subtle way that sometimes we show favoritism. Why? Because sometimes it's just easier to go to somebody that we know. Sometimes it's a little bit easier to go to somebody else that is a familiar face. And I'm not saying it's wrong to go to somebody that maybe you saw last week and, oh, you're a familiar face, I met you last week. But I'm talking about how it's easy sometimes for maybe just to maybe chat with your spouse next to you. Or maybe turn around and see that same face that you see every single week to ask them that question. I think this is one of the very subtle ways that we show favoritism, where we say, it's honestly easier just to go to somebody that I feel is just going to be less drama. It's just going to be simpler. Who do you think takes better care of themselves when they walk through that door 2,000 years ago? A rich person? They probably can handle themselves well, but someone that might need to sit up in this chair, someone that James might be talking about, that says this person needs to sit here. Look, I know it's extra work, and I know it takes extra intentionality, and I know that there might be times where you have to show just a little bit of extra grace, but I guarantee you it's worth it, because if you show favoritism and you show partiality to somebody else, you're missing it completely. And what James is talking about is, I'd be willing to have a conversation with you that your faith is not authentic. Why? Because we don't trust God in these moments of these uncomfortable moments where maybe we have to go, I got to go find somebody new. Or I have to be able to look past the exterior and be able to work on getting to know somebody on the interior. Our tendency is really no different. This is what we often do. We judge by what we see on the outside. I bet we've probably asked the very same question in 2 different ways. We see a rich person with a nice car and beautiful clothes, and we ask ourselves, wow, I wonder what they did to get here. And then we see a poor person that might be living on the streets, that might be, again, knocking on your door, asking for help, or someone that you see over and over and over again, maybe somebody that might need just a little bit of extra grace in your life. And maybe you thought, wow, I wonder what they've done to get here. And it's our posture towards them. Do you see somebody for who they are, or do you see somebody for what they are? Because oftentimes, if we just look on the exterior, it's just what they can do. It's what it looks like they can do. But the more that you get to know somebody, the more that you get to understand who someone really is, it makes all the difference. And James is cautioning his readers 2,000 years ago, and it's a caution that still makes sense today. You see, there's nothing wrong with dressing nice. There's nothing wrong with having money. There's nothing wrong with experiencing nice clothing. There's nothing wrong with that. But if your motivation for seeking friendship, approval, or advancement has everything to do with the way that you perceive someone's exterior, I would challenge that you're doing it wrong. I would consider to you, I would appeal to you to maybe consider it a different way. Jesus, by the way, sets the example here. Jesus sets the example. In Mark chapter 2, verses 13 to 17, he says this, "Then Jesus went out to a lakeshore again, and he taught the crowds that were coming to him. As he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at his tax collector's booth. 'Follow me and be my disciple,' Jesus said to him. So Levi got up and followed him." Remember that 2% that I said? They're like gaining wealth, and it's probably ill-gotten gain. Matthew's probably included in that. He was a Jew, but he also worked for the Romans. So he had like 1 foot. He was hated by everybody. The Jews hated him because he worked for the Romans. The Romans actually hated him because he was Jewish, but they're like, we got to get a hot body in here, whatever, just make him do his thing. And so chances are Matthew's probably got ill-gotten gain, so he's probably in that 2%. And yet Jesus walks up to his tax booth one day, and Matthew's just kind of doing his thing, and Jesus says, "Hey, follow me. Be my disciple." And you're like, accountants have a place in God's kingdom? That's amazing. And if you want to hear more about that story, you should come hang out with us this Sunday when I talk about my accounting background. That's going to be fun. It's going to be a fun one. It's going to be great. He says, "Follow me and be my disciple." So guess what? Levi got up and he followed him. Later, Levi invited Jesus and his disciples to his home as dinner guests, along with many other tax collectors. And this might be one of my favorite lines in all of Scripture because I really see it as a thesaurus opportunity for myself. It says, disreputable sinners. Like the worst of the worst. This is who shows up, and it's Jesus with these horrible sinners. It says there were many people of this kind among Jesus' followers. Think it's popular for somebody to follow somebody that they don't respect or like? You would never follow anybody that didn't respect you or show consideration to you or show respect to you. And yet we see here, I love this note right here, that all kinds of people of this status followed Jesus. These were Jesus' followers. Verse 16, "But when the teachers of the religious law, who were Pharisees, saw him eating with tax collectors and other sinners, they asked his disciples, 'Who would eat with such scum?' When Jesus heard this, he told them, guess what? Healthy people don't need a doctor. Sick people do. And I've come to call those who think they are righteous, not to those who think they are righteous, but to those who know that they are sinners." These are the kinds of people that Jesus chose to hang out with. These are the people that James is saying, you have to stop rejecting them. You have to just stop taking one look at them and saying they have no value in God's kingdom. They have no value here on this earth. They have immense value. They have eternal value. Every single soul that walks this earth, as long as there is breath in their lungs, has value in God's eyes. And it's our responsibility as the church to make sure that we reflect that and make sure that we lead out on that. Jesus surrounded himself with people that knew that they needed heart change. They knew that they needed heart change. It didn't matter who it was, a wealthy tax collector like Levi or Matthew, or a wretched, outcast, disreputable sinner. Jesus sought people so that they could realize that they could change and they could see the glory of God rather than the glory of themselves. You see, what Jesus did is he valued the interior rather than just judging by the exterior. And I bet there's probably some people in every single one of our lives where this is probably hitting home a little bit. That our responsibility is to get to know somebody. It's so hard though. And we come up with a lot of different excuses. But I'm an introvert. It's hard for me. It's inconvenient. I don't really have time. What is this? Let me tell you a story that literally just happened probably an hour and a half ago. I was in the green room, and I had just gotten here, and I was going over some of my notes, and there was a knock at the door. And it was a woman that I opened the door for. It literally just happened. And I opened it. I've met this woman 2 or 3 other times. And I didn't know her name. I forgot. I called her by the wrong name. And I thought, you know what? It would be easier for me just to say, "Oh, so sorry." And just, okay, I'll talk to people where I do know their name. Or that I remember them. And I sat there, and there was a seat next to me, and I kicked it. I kicked it just kind of aside. And I said, "Come sit down. Let me spend 10 minutes with you. I want to get to know your story a little bit." And she got to share some of her background. And I'm not patting myself on the back. I'm saying that there are moments throughout our day where we think that we're so busy and we think that we have a lot going on, where all it takes is 10 minutes. All it takes is 10 minutes. I think I maybe asked 5 questions. And there's opportunities for us to experience connection like this. And I wasn't judging this person by the way that they looked, but it was a moment for me to choose to go get to know somebody. Because on the exterior, couldn't even remember her name. Well, I remembered a name, but it was wrong. But I knew that if I got to know her, it would be a name that I would never forget. And now I know a story of this woman that I met, who I've met a few other times. My point is this: if we're willing to put in the effort, we'll see fruit come from it. And it might not be immediate. It might be deferred fruit. It might be things that we plant a seed and we see things begin to grow. Favoritism contradicts an authentic faith. Are you willing to put in the time and effort? Because what happens is our faith is a reflection of choosing to see people for who they are. Number 2, favoritism dishonors God's values. Favoritism dishonors God's values. James continues verses 5 through 7. He says, listen to me, dear brothers and sisters. Hasn't God chosen the poor in this world to be rich in faith? Aren't they the ones who will inherit the kingdom he promised to those who love him? But you dishonor the poor. Isn't it the rich who oppress you and drag you into court? Aren't they the ones who slander Jesus Christ, whose noble name you bear? Which begs the question, what exactly are God's values? What is it that God values? Do you know what the very first line of the greatest message ever preached is? Matthew chapter 5, Sermon on the Mount. 2 years ago, I had the opportunity to be in Israel, and I took this picture overlooking the Sea of Galilee. You'll go and you'll read many different parables, and you'll read many different stories where it says Jesus would climb up on a hillside. You ready for it? He would sit down. Everybody else would stand, but he would sit there and he'd tell a story. And this overlooked the Sea of Galilee. In fact, behind me in that particular picture right there is a church called the Mount of the Beatitudes. And this is where they, there's certain spots in Israel where it really could be anywhere, but they built a church there, and this looks like it could be an opportunity where Jesus would have taught this particular sermon. And do you know what the very first line out of Jesus' mouth was? It was this, Matthew 5:3. By the way, he didn't start with a joke. He didn't talk about the time where John the Baptist beat him in racketball. Like, he would have got right into the message, and he would have said this: God blesses those who are poor and realize their need for him, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. The first words out of Jesus' mouth in this message was a completely flipped upside down kingdom where he said, guess what? I came for the people that recognize their need for me. And they may look like they're poor, but man, they could be rich in spirit. And by the way, guess what that population was? It was about 90% of people that would have heard that and said, wait, I have value? Because I got other people telling me that I don't. That they're judging me by the way that I look. I love how the message says it. It says, Matthew 5:3, the message says, you're blessed when you're at the end of your rope. With less of you, there is more of God and his rule. You see, stuff, things in our lives, even significance, what it does is it creates a tendency and a temptation to make less room for God in our lives. Why? Because we think that we can control and manipulate every single situation. I can manipulate somebody to do what I want them to do for me, all because I can tell that they look like they can do something for me. And so I'm going to befriend them. I'm going to try and win them over. I'm going to try and woo them. I'm going to try and do something that's going to make it look like, oh man, that guy's really nice. I should give him all my money. I should go do something. And this is what Jesus is warning about. There's opportunities for us all the time that there's people that are so much more less fortunate. And it doesn't even have to do with money. It has to do with even significance or even status. If you look at every single thing that our global outreach does here at Crossroads, which is comprised of our local outreach and our international outreach, it's all about bringing the message of Jesus to various different kinds of people. And one of the most impactful things that we do as a church is every summer we put on a summer camp for kids who are in the foster system. It's called Royal Family Kids Camp. Yeah, many of you have been a part of that. Many of you guys have served at that. Pastor Joey does a phenomenal job of leading that. Many of you have been a part of that. And there's some incredible people that come alongside Tommy and Michelle Greenwood do an incredible job of helping provide leadership in that ministry as well. And what happens is they go away for a week to a camp, and it's children who are in the foster system, who have troubled backgrounds, who would never be able to experience something like this if a church like Crossroads, and there's other great churches in the area that do things that are similar, but these children would never have this opportunity to go do something like this if we just decided that, you know what, it's just so much easier to appeal to people that look like they have a future. And you know what that whole week does? It communicates to them that they have a hope and that they have a future and that their future is not defined by their past circumstances or their present circumstances. And there are people that love and care on them in the best ways. And they need about 20 more volunteers. They need about 20 more volunteers to help pull off that week. Maybe you're sitting in here and you're feeling like, man, there's something that I needed to do. They go away in June. I believe it's the week of June 9th. And maybe you're sitting there and you're like, this is something that I can do. You can text the word CAMP, C-A-M-P, to 77247 if you want to find out more. But the reality is we want to present opportunities every single day that remind us as a church that what we do matters, because we're not going to look past people just because they may not check certain boxes or look a particular way or maybe have a background that we're like, oh man, that seems like it's way too difficult and a lot of grace and energy is going to be required. It's just going to be easier for somebody else that may just look like they have their life put together. We present opportunities like this as a church all the time, and if you want to jump in and be a part of that, man, I encourage you to do that. I have the opportunity and blessing to go speak to the leaders on that Sunday night, and I'll be excited to be with all of you that are there. But this is a phenomenal way to be able to put handles on what it looks like to reject favoritism, to reject partiality, and maybe you're looking to embrace an opportunity like that. This might be an opportunity for you to do that. My question for you is this: are your eyes fixed on eternal matters or on earthly materials? Are your eyes fixed on eternal matters or earthly materials? This is a real question that we have to consider. Jesus just would have said in that sermon, look, blessed are the poor in spirit, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Blessed are those that realize that they're at the end of their rope, that they might be physically bankrupt, but they also might be spiritually bankrupt. Are you willing to invest the time and the energy to impact those? Favoritism contradicts an authentic faith. Favoritism dishonors God's values. And number 3, we'll close with this: favoritism violates the law of love. James finishes his section here talking about this particular sin of partiality. And he says this: yes, indeed, it is good. James chapter 2, verses 8 through 13. Yes, indeed, it is good when you obey the royal law as found in the scriptures. Love your neighbor as yourself. But if you favor some people over others, you're committing a sin. You're guilty of breaking the law. For the person who keeps all the laws except for one is as guilty as the person who's broken all the laws. A familiar saying that gets thrown around really by me in our household is this: partial disobedience is still full disobedience. So if you're only going to pick and choose certain things in this book that you want to follow, then you might as well have broken all of them. This is what James is saying right here. For the same God who said you must not commit adultery, verse 11, also said you must not murder. So if you murder someone but do not commit adultery, you're still broken the law. So whatever you say and whatever you do, remember that you will be judged by the law that sets you free. There will be no mercy for those who have not shown mercy to others. But if you have been merciful, God will be merciful when he judges you. You see, by showing favoritism, we break the command to love our neighbor as ourselves, thereby transgressing the entire law, and we expose ourselves to judgment without any possibility of mercy. As I read in Lamentations chapter 3, one of the prayers that I have an opportunity to pray with my children if I happen to bring them to school on a particular day is I always thank God for the new mercies that we have every single day.